The first thing Leah Hunter noticed when she stepped onto the range was the silence, not the good kind, not the sacred hush before a great shot. This was the heavy, suffocating quiet that came from being unwanted. Heads turned, whispers sparked, smirks slid across faces. If you've ever walked into a place where you were judged before you spoke, measured before you moved, then you'll understand what happened next, because this wasn't just another practice day at the Pine Valley Elite Shooting Club. This was the day the legends learned what real silence sounded like, and it started with a woman they didn't even bother to see. Lee adjusted the strap on her second-hand duffel bag, her boots crunching softly on the gravel. Around her, shooters moved like dancers, adjusting sleek, custom-fitted rifles, sighting expensive optics, wearing embroidered jackets marked with national titles and sponsor patches. It was a temple to precision, to reputation, and Lee, she looked like a misprint, faded jeans. Plain gray hoodie, a simple bolt-action rifle wrapped carefully in an old towel, no logos, no entourage, no name they recognized, just a quiet woman carrying something heavier than a weapon, the memory of a promise. The registration desk was manned by a young woman with perfect hair and a laminated name badge. She didn't smile when Lee approached. She barely looked up. "Members only," she said, the words flat. Lee pulled a folded slip of paper from her pocket, the competition flyer that clearly stated open range practice. "All levels welcome. I'm here for the open session," Lee said quietly. The girl scanned the paper like it might infect her. Then, with a sigh, she gestured toward the far end of the line. Lane 17, the furthest from the center, closest to the maintenance shed. Lee nodded, said thank you, and walked on. The girl didn't reply. She was already laughing with the shooter behind her, a tall man in a black jacket who sneered as Lee passed. At lane 17, Lee unpacked carefully. The old rifle, a Remington 700, scratched and well-loved, felt solid in her hands. Not flashy, not new, but true. She placed a small photo next to her ammo box, a black and white image of a man in a military uniform, smiling faintly, her father. Master Sergeant Robert Hunter, decorated sniper, coach, teacher, gone now, but not silent, never silent. "You don't have to shout to be deadly, kid," he used to say. "Let your skill do the talking." Across the range, a cluster of elite shooters gathered. At their center was Hunter Kane, the reigning national precision shooting champion. Broad-shouldered, sun-creased face, the kind of man who owned every room without trying. Hunter caught sight of Lee setting up, grinned. "Looks like we got ourselves a visitor from Walmart," he drawled, loud enough to carry. The others laughed on cue. Terry Simmons, three-time state champion, shook his head. "Probably thinks open practice means open for amateurs." Even the assistant coaches chuckled, the legend killers, the kings and queens of the sport, and not one of them spared a second to wonder what Leah Hunter carried in her bones. What discipline had been forged in her bloodline, what lessons had been carved into her breath and muscle over decades of silence and steel. Lee didn't react. She didn't flinch. She set up her rifle on the simple bipod, adjusted her sling, checked the bolt, loaded 3 rounds into the internal magazine with slow, steady movements. The targets were set at 600 yards, a distance that separated pretenders from true marksmen. It wasn't about strength. It was about stillness, about breathing so deep the world narrowed to a pinprick, about letting the weight of the rifle, the air, the earth, all of it, pass through you without tremor. Lee settled into prone position, left hand controlling the forend, right hand cradling the grip, cheek resting against the worn stock, the familiar embrace of an old friend. Breath in. Breath out, hold halfway, trigger squeeze, crack. The sound split the air, sharp, clean on the far side of the range. The small metal gong at 600 yards rang out with a clear, undeniable chime, dead center. The rangemaster, adjusting spotting scopes, froze mid-motion. Terry Simmons lowered his binoculars slowly, disbelief spreading across his face. Hunter Kane frowned, shifting his weight. Lee chambered another round, breath in, breath out, hold halfway, trigger squeeze, crack. Another perfect hit, gong singing across the field, this time sharper. Louder somehow, like the mountains themselves acknowledging her aim. The laughter faded, the whispering stopped. Only the wind moved now, tugging softly at the flags, cooling the sudden heat in the faces of men who realized too late they had been laughing at a storm. Lee didn't look at them. She didn't need to, she was somewhere else, On a cold ridge in the high desert where her father taught her to read mirage drift, to feel the pull of gravity on a bullet's arc, to trust the silence. Focus beats flash, he had said once, adjusting her elbow during a long-range drill. A lot of them talk, you'll just hit. She fired the third shot. Crack. The gong sang once more, perfect harmony, perfect truth, 3 shots, 3 centers, without drama, without spectacle, just breathe, focus, release. Across the range, Hunter Kane set his rifle down slowly. No smile now. No jokes. He watched Lee rise to her knees, calmly eject the spent casing and begin wiping down the action, efficient, unhurried, like a surgeon cleaning after a flawless operation. One of the assistant coaches, a former Army marksman, muttered under his breath, "That's no amateur." Hunter shot him a glare but said nothing, because even legends recognize when they are standing in the presence of something greater, even if pride won't let them admit it yet. Lee packed up with the same care she unpacked. No rush. No need to savor the stares or bask in the stunned silence. The real ones, the ones who have walked long roads alone, know. The goal was never to silence the room. The goal was to stay true to the shot, to the breath, to the promise. As she slung the duffel over her shoulder and walked quietly off lane 17, the only sound that followed her was not laughter, not scorn, but the hollow, echoing silence of recognition. And the legends, the kings and queens of the Pine Valley elite, for the first time in a long time, had nothing left to say. Not because she shouted, not because she argued, because she hit, because she stayed, because some storms don't announce themselves with thunder. They announce themselves with 3 clean shots and a silence no ego can break. Silence has a strange aftertaste. It lingers. It itches at pride. It gnaws at certainty. And for the legends of Pine Valley Elite Shooting Club, Leah Hunter's 3 perfect shots left a silence none of them could escape. They tried. Oh, they tried, with jokes, with rumors, with carefully constructed walls built from ego and insecurity. But walls built in panic never stand long. In the clubhouse later that afternoon, the legends gathered around the oak tables, drinks in hand, forced laughter bouncing off the polished wood floors. Hunter Kane sat at the center, the king among uneasy courtiers. "So what?" Terry Simmons said, too loudly. "Anybody can get lucky once." A few nodded, grateful for someone to say it. "Exactly," Kristen Vale chimed in, swirling her iced tea like a cocktail. "Maybe her scope was zeroed weird. Maybe the range wind shifted." Hunter said nothing. He stared into the melting ice of his glass, jaw tight. Because deep down, beneath the shield of bluster, he knew luck didn't group shots like that at 600 yards. Luck didn't stack 3 gongs with military-grade precision under pressure while the room sneered. Skill did. Skill they didn't have words for yet. Skill they hadn't been prepared to face, and it scared them, more than any missed shot ever had. Meanwhile, Leah Hunter walked the gravel paths behind the clubhouse alone, not angry, not gloating, just breathing, each breath clearing away the old doubts that had clung to her for too long. "You're not made for their world," those doubts had once whispered. "You're too simple, too quiet, too small." But simplicity wasn't weakness, it was focus. And Lee had learned long ago, on cold mornings on hunting trails with her father, that quiet wasn't an accident, it was armor. It was aim. It was survival. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low over the pines, an assistant coach named Mr. Garcia approached Lee by the practice berms. He was older than the others, less polished, more honest. He wore a battered range safety officer hat and spoke with the slow certainty of a man who had seen too many braggarts fall. "You shoot?" he asked simply. Lee smiled faintly. "Sometimes." Garcia chuckled, the sound like gravel turning. "You shot today," he said. "Better than any of them." Lee shrugged. "I had a good teacher." Garcia nodded slowly, studying her. "You ever compete?" Lee shook her head. "Not officially." He raised an eyebrow. "Should." Lee tilted her head slightly. "Why?" Garcia's gaze drifted back toward the clubhouse, where Hunter and the others were still trying to laugh their embarrassment away. "Because legends rot when they're unchallenged," he said. "And you, Miss Hunter, you're a storm coming for dry timber." The next morning, a new flyer appeared on the bulletin board in the main lobby. Pine Valley Elite Invitational Challenge. All ranks welcome. A prestigious internal match. A chance for members and any accepted guests to challenge the standing elite shooters. Hunter Kane's name was already inked in at the top. Terry Simmons, Kristen Vale, a dozen others. The bold letters underneath dared anyone to enter, prove you belong. Lee stood in front of the flyer for a long moment, duffel strap over her shoulder. Several members brushed past her without acknowledgement. One young shooter, maybe 18, hovered nervously, glancing between Lee and the sign-up sheet. Finally, he blurted, "They don't want you to." Lee turned, raising an eyebrow. He flushed, embarrassed but earnest. "They think you're bad for the club's image, that you make them look bad." Lee considered that for a moment. Then she smiled. It wasn't bitter, it wasn't angry. It was the calm smile of someone who understood storms don't ask permission to roll in. They just come. She stepped forward, picked up the pen, and signed her name at the bottom of the sheet. Leah Hunter, simple, clear, undeniable. By noon, the clubhouse buzzed. Phones lit up with texts. Conversations twisted in hallways and locker rooms. "Did you see?" She signed up. "What if she's a ringer, a plant?" Hunter's furious. Hunter Kane stood in the trainer's office, glaring at the sign-up sheet pinned to the corkboard. He stabbed a finger at Lee's name. "This is a circus," he growled. Mr. Delaney, the club manager, shrugged. "It's an open challenge, Hunter. Always has been." Hunter's mouth twisted. "You think some nobody, some backyard shooter deserves to share a line with us?" Delaney leaned back in his chair. "I think the targets don't care about names. Only hits." Hunter stormed out, the door slamming hard enough to rattle the trophies on the shelves. In the week leading up to the Invitational, Lee practiced alone. Not because she was unwelcome, though she was, but because that's how she had always trained. No cameras, no cheering crowds. Just repetition, breath, focus, release. The others trained harder too, Hunter especially. He pushed himself at distances he usually mocked as warm-up shots. He switched rifles twice, seeking some mechanical edge. But the harder he tried to forget that sound, the pure, clean crack of Lee's first shot, the louder it echoed in his mind. On Friday evening, Lee arrived at the range late, after most others had gone. She set up on lane 14, a narrow, less glamorous firing line near the far tree line. The wind picked up, brushing leaves into soft murmurs. She didn't mind. Wind was just another voice to listen to, another challenge to read. Halfway through her session, she sensed someone approaching. She didn't turn. Hunter Kane stood behind her, arms crossed. His shadow stretched long across the gravel. "You're not gonna make it easy, are you?" he said finally. Lee wiped down her bolt with a soft cloth. "No," she said simply. Hunter snorted. "You know they'll back me no matter what. Legacy, record, all of it." Lee finally looked over her shoulder. Her gaze was steady, unflinching. "Legends aren't kept alive by votes," she said. "They're kept alive by results." For a moment, something flickered across Hunter's face. Respect, fear, maybe just recognition. He didn't answer. He just turned and walked back toward the parking lot, the evening swallowing him whole. As Lee packed up, she took one last look at the range. Tomorrow it would be full of shooters, judges, spectators, of expectation, of noise. But tonight it was hers. The same gravel crunching underfoot, the same target standing patient and silent, the same air thick with promise. She reached into her bag and pulled out the small photograph of her father, taped it inside her duffel, tucked just where she could see it when she reached for her ammo. "Breathe, focus, release," she whispered. And somewhere in the darkness, among the rustling trees and the whistling wind, it felt like an answer whispered back. Tomorrow wasn't about crushing egos. It wasn't about silencing names. It was about truth. And when Leah Hunter took her place on the line, truth would not be shouted. It would be whispered, one shot at a time. Well, before we continue, if you're enjoying this story and love such dramas, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Every new subscriber keeps me motivated to dig deeper, uncover more wild stories, and bring you even crazier content. Your support means everything. It's what keeps this channel going strong. And trust me, there's plenty more chaos coming your way. Back to the story. Morning broke sharp and golden across Pine Valley. A crisp breeze stirred the flags over the range. The smell of gun oil and fresh-cut grass hung heavy in the air. Targets gleamed at the far end, like distant promises waiting to be broken. Today wasn't a normal competition. Today was about territory, legacy, fear. And somewhere between those brittle egos and cold steel lanes, Leah Hunter walked quietly, carrying nothing but her father's lessons and a rifle almost as weathered as her own patience. Competitors milled around in clusters, adjusting rifles, calibrating scopes, trading nervous jokes. At the center of it all, Hunter Kane held court, laughing, clapping shoulders, tossing casual remarks like smoke grenades to hide the crack in his confidence. He spotted Lee moving toward the competitor tables and smirked. "Hope someone remembered to bring her crayons," he said loudly. A few chuckled. The kind of laughter that's sharp at the edges, not funny, just defensive. Lee didn't flinch. She found her assigned table, number 27, off to the side, and began unpacking methodically. Rifle, ammo box, scope cloth, nothing fancy, nothing flashy, everything necessary, nothing more. Terry Simmons approached, grinning wide. "You sure you're ready for this, sweetheart?" he said, voice dripping false kindness. Lee adjusted her rear bag without looking up. "Are you?" Terry blinked, thrown off balance. Behind him, Kristen Vale narrowed her eyes. She hated when targets didn't behave properly. "Careful," Kristen said, voice syrupy. "Wouldn't want to embarrass yourself on your big day." Lee met her gaze steadily. "No danger of that," she said simply. Then she turned back to her rifle, dismissing them both without another word. The quiet cut deeper than any insult. The first rounds began at 50 meters, standard warm-up. Lee moved through it without drama, center hits, tight groupings, crisp trigger control. The legends did well too, no mistakes yet, no cracks in the armor. Hunter Kane even pulled a perfect group, and the crowd, mostly friends, sponsors, club loyalists, roared approval. Lee heard none of it. She heard only the measured rhythm of her breath, the soft metallic click of her bolt cycling, the subtle change in the wind as the morning warmed. At 200 meters, things began to shift. Hunter fired slightly early, eager maybe, and his shot clipped the high ring, barely missing center. A ripple of unease passed through the crowd. He recovered quickly with the next two, but the seed was planted. Doubt is a patient weed. Meanwhile, Lee continued her silent march. Every shot methodical, every result undeniable. She wasn't flashy. She didn't pump her fists or celebrate after each hit. She simply confirmed impact, adjusted her scope when needed, and prepared the next round, professional, deadly, unshakable. By the third stage, whispers had started in the spectator gallery. "Who is she really? She's not just lucky, right? Did you see that group? That's military precision." Hunter heard them. Terry heard them. Kristen heard them, and it gnawed at them. They weren't used to being questioned. They weren't used to watching someone without a name or sponsor pull focus from their curated mythologies. And so, they did what threatened pride always does. They plotted. Between stages, as shooters reloaded and recalibrated, Hunter approached Lee's table. His smile was thin, predatory. "Listen," he said quietly, voice for her ears alone. "It's not too late to step back, bow out gracefully. No shame in knowing your limits." Lee finished adjusting her rear bag, straightened, looked him square in the eye. "Thank you," she said. Hunter blinked, confused by the lack of fear. Then Lee added, voice low and steady, "But you might need that advice more than I do." Hunter's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to reply, then thought better of it. He turned sharply and stalked off. A few spectators nearby caught the exchange. One, a younger competitor, chuckled under his breath. The legends were bleeding reputation one tiny cut at a time, and they couldn't even stop it. Stage 4 introduced wind targets, 600 meters, cross-breeze conditions. This was where reputations made their stand. Hunter preened a little as he prepared his shot, adjusting for wind drift like a man conducting an orchestra. His first shot was solid, dead center. Relief flashed across his face. He lined up the second, fired. A moment's hesitation in the breeze, barely perceptible, pushed his round just off center. Not a bad shot, but not perfect. He cursed softly under his breath. Lee took her lane without fanfare, settled into her firing position. The crowd leaned forward. No one talked. Even the birds seemed to pause their songs. Breath in, breath out, hold halfway, trigger squeeze, crack, direct hit, flawless. And unlike Hunter, she didn't waste a moment celebrating. She simply reloaded, adjusted, fired again, crack, another direct hit. The scoreboard operator hesitated before flipping the numbers, almost unbelieving. The young competitor from earlier pumped his fist quietly where he sat. The winds of the range carried whispers now. "She's for real. She's better than him. Watch her, she's teaching a clinic." Hunter gathered his team in a tight huddle during the lunch break. Terry, Kristen, Aaron, one of the range staff, sympathetic to them. They spoke low, urgent. "Heard they're rechecking equipment before finals," Terry muttered. Hunter's face twisted. "We need something. Anything." "She can't win clean." Kristen leaned in. "I can talk to Aaron. Maybe the calibration on her scope gets adjusted." Terry hesitated. "That's dirty, man." Hunter's voice dropped to a growl. "This isn't about fair, it's about survival." Kristen smiled thinly. "I'll handle it." And just like that, the legends who once ruled by skill prepared to rule by sabotage. Desperation never makes for clean hands. Meanwhile, Lee sat alone at the far end of the cafeteria, eating a simple sandwich. She wasn't isolated because she was rejected. She was alone because real warriors know the battle is always fought first inside. No drama, no noise, just breathe, focus, release. As she sipped her coffee, she noticed a flicker of movement near the competitor benches outside, someone near her station. Furtive, hurried, Lee said nothing. Made no scene, because storms don't announce their presence. They let the lightning speak. When she returned to her lane later, she checked everything: scope, rifle, settings, tiny, almost invisible. The slightest adjustment on her zero stop, the mechanism that prevented her scope from being overcorrected, subtle, but dangerous if unnoticed. She smiled faintly, reset it calmly. No panic, because storms don't rage at sabotage. They simply outlast it, outshoot it, outshine it. As the final rounds were called, Lee stepped onto the line, the simple woman in the faded hoodie and second-hand boots, facing the legends armed with money, reputation, and desperation. And she smiled, not for them, not for the crowd, for herself, because this was never about crushing egos. It was about proving one quiet truth: skill is louder than myth and breath. Focus, release, would silence every lie they tried to build. The final stage of the Invitational was designed to separate champions from contenders. 500 meters, 5 targets, limited time. One shot each, miss once and your score plummeted. Hit them all and your name was carved into the club's history. The legends knew this stage well. It had been built for them, crafted around their strengths, their swagger. But today, the field didn't belong to them. It belonged to something they hadn't accounted for. It belonged to Leah Hunter. Hunter Kane adjusted his rifle with sharp, anxious movements. Terry Simmons paced behind him, muttering under his breath. Kristen Vale sat stone-faced, her fingers drumming the stock of her competition rifle. The sabotage plan had failed. Erin had managed to tamper with Lee's scope, barely, but she had caught it, reset it. No protest, no drama, just the unshakable calm of someone who knew the real fight wasn't fought with cheap tricks. It was fought with breath, steel, and silence. And they were losing, badly. The announcer called the finalists to the firing line. The crowd pressed closer, phones lifted. Commentators whispered into microphones. Hunter stepped into his lane with a fixed smile, all teeth, no warmth. Lee walked to hers without expression. If nerves flickered inside her, they showed nowhere on her face. She set her rifle down, checked her sling, tested her bipod. Every movement exact, unrushed. Hunter watched her from the corner of his eye, feeling the fraying threads of his composure. He'd faced pressure before, but not this. Not the kind of pressure that comes when your mask starts to crack and the whole world is watching. Hunter shot first. He hit the first target clean, a good start. Second shot clipped the edge but within the scoring zone. Third shot dead center. A murmur of approval from the loyalists in the stands. Fourth shot, high right, barely catching the target, visible tension in his jaw now. Fifth and final shot rushed, wide, off target. The miss echoed louder than the shots themselves. Hunter cursed under his breath. The legends stirred restlessly. They knew, he knew. The window was open, and Leah Hunter was already stepping through it. Lee approached the line. The world narrowed around her. No crowd, no cameras, no names, only distance, only breath. Only her father's voice, steady and certain, focus on the space between heartbeats. She settled into position, lined up the first target, breath in, breath out, half hold, trigger squeeze, crack, dead center, first target down. No celebration, no hesitation. Next target, breath in. Breath out, crack, second target, clean, third, fourth. Every shot a quiet song of defiance. Every impact a wordless statement louder than any victory speech. When she raised her head to face the fifth target, a ripple passed through the crowd. She didn't blink, didn't falter. Just breathed, just believed, crack. The final target shuddered, struck dead center with surgical precision. 5 shots, 5 perfect hits. The scoreboard lit up with her score, a flawless run. The gallery erupted, but Lee heard none of it. Her world was still narrowed to that sacred space between breath and silence, the place where legends fall and real ones rise. Hunter stood frozen at his lane, rifle dangling forgotten in his hands. Terry and Kristen hovered near him, white-faced, silent. They understood. Even if they couldn't say it, it was over, not just today, not just a competition. The myth they had built of invincibility, of superiority, of gatekept greatness had cracked. And through that crack, Leah Hunter had walked, without apology, without noise, without fear. When Leah returned to her bench, she found Mr. Garcia waiting, the old range officer with the battered hat and the sharp, knowing eyes. He tipped his cap slightly. "Textbook," he said quietly. "Every shot a love letter to discipline." Leah smiled faintly. "Thank you." Garcia leaned closer, voice low. "You got fans, you know. Real ones. Ones who don't care about brand names or trophies. They care about the shot." Lee's throat tightened unexpectedly, not from pride, from gratitude, from the quiet joy of being seen, truly seen, without having to shout. The awards ceremony was almost anticlimactic. The judges tried to keep their faces neutral, but the awe bled through. They handed Leah the trophy, a sleek steel plaque engraved with the club's crest. She accepted it calmly, murmured thanks. No speeches, no grandstanding. Just a small, respectful nod to the room. Hunter Kane watched from the far side of the gallery, arms crossed, jaw set, and though he didn't speak, the defeat etched into his face said everything. Legends built on arrogance don't survive truth. They crack, they crumble. They blow away like dust in the first honest wind. As the crowd dispersed, Kristen Vale approached Hunter, her designer shooting jacket slung over her shoulder. "We'll get it back," she said tightly. Hunter shook his head once. "No," he said, "she didn't just beat us." He looked across the range, watching Leah quietly pack her things, the battered rifle, the faded gear, the woman who had silenced a roomful of legends without ever raising her voice. She changed the whole game. Later that night, long after the crowds had gone, Leah returned to the range. She set a single target at 600 yards. Alone under the stars, she loaded 3 rounds into her old Remington. No witnesses, no fanfare, just her and the truth. She fired the first shot, crack, center. She cycled the bolt, second shot, crack, center. She breathed deeply, feeling the stillness of the earth beneath her, the vast sky above, third shot, crack, dead center, a quiet chorus carrying through the darkness. Not to prove anything, not to anyone, just to honor the promise she made long ago. Shoot true, even when no one's watching. As Leah packed up, she glanced once more at the silent field. Tomorrow, someone would find the target riddled with perfect holes and wonder who had left such a mark. Maybe they'd guess. Maybe they wouldn't. It didn't matter. Because real legends aren't written in headlines. They're written in breath, in focus, in the silence that follows a perfect shot. And in that silence, Leah Hunter stood taller than any name etched on any trophy, because she didn't need to silence others to rise. She simply became the silence they could no longer escape. Fame doesn't always arrive with a roar. Sometimes it creeps in, quiet as a rising tide, until you look around and realize you're standing somewhere entirely new. That's how it came for Leah Hunter. Not with flashing cameras. Not with screaming crowds. It started with whispers, and those whispers built into something she could no longer ignore. The day after the Invitational, Leah's name was everywhere inside Pine Valley Elite, on the lips of newcomers, in the emails flying between club board members. Even scribbled hastily on sponsor scouting reports, find her, sign her, make her part of the brand. They didn't know where she had come from. They didn't know who had trained her. But they knew one thing, skill like that didn't stay in the shadows for long. And everyone wanted a piece of the storm they hadn't seen coming. Her first official offer arrived on crisp letterheads slipped into her clubhouse locker. A corporate shooting gear brand, Falcon Precision. Big money, big contracts. All she had to do was sign, wear their logo, pose for photos. Smile at the right moments, be their champion, their story. Leah stared at the letter for a long time. A year ago, she couldn't have imagined an offer like this. 10 years ago, she might have dreamed of it, but now she wasn't so sure. Because while success can elevate, it can also shackle. And Leah Hunter had never carried a leash well. Hunter Kane saw it all happening, of course. He watched Leah's quiet rise with the kind of hollow ache only the dethroned understand. At first, he told himself it was temporary, a fluke. The buzz would fade. The club would remember who had built it, whose trophies lined the halls. But by midweek, the truth gnawed at him. Leah wasn't a passing storm. She was the new weather system, and the legends they were relics standing beneath a sky that no longer needed them. The next Saturday, Lee returned to the range early. She found her old spot, lane 17, where this entire quiet revolution had begun. As she set up, footsteps crunched the gravel behind her. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. Hunter Kane. He stood there, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, jaw tight. For a moment neither spoke. Finally, Hunter cleared his throat. "You're good," he said roughly. Lee adjusted her bipod. "I know," he chuckled, a dry, self-deprecating sound. "I used to think the range was mine," he said, voice almost gentle. "That skill and money and reputation made it so." Lee loaded around calmly. "And now," Hunter shrugged, "now I know places like this don't belong to legends." He paused, then added, "They belong to whoever shows up and earns them." Lee glanced at him, then really looked, saw the man beneath the myth, the pride, the fear, the reluctant respect. She offered him a small, almost imperceptible nod, a truce. Nothing more needed to be said. Some wars end not with surrender but with acknowledgement. The day grew warmer. The range filled with new shooters, many younger, inspired by Lee's quiet revolution. Some wore second-hand gear. Some had no sponsors. They came not to flash their pedigree, but to test their breath, their focus, their courage. And Lee, she kept shooting, kept practicing, kept staying true, because the world might be shifting around her, but the fundamentals hadn't changed, not for her, not for what mattered. Offers kept coming, emails, phone calls, a formal invitation to appear on a televised shooting championship, each offer glossier than the last, each one asking quietly or loudly for Lee to become something else, bigger, louder, more marketable. At night, Lee sat on her small balcony, the city lights humming in the distance. She read through the contracts, the endorsement agreements, the scripted interviews they wanted her to give. Tell them your humble backstory, smile more, mention the brand first thing after a win. She sipped her coffee slowly, no rush, no fear. Because while they offered her the world, Lee knew not every offer is a blessing. Some are cages, painted gold. And Leah Hunter had never been built for cages. It was Michael Reeves, her father's old friend, who cut through the noise. He called late one evening, his voice rough but warm. "Word travels," he said without preamble. "You're making waves, kid." Lee smiled. "I didn't plan to," Michael chuckled. "Real storms never do." There was a pause. Then he asked, voice lower, "You sure you want all this?" Lee leaned back, staring up at the night sky. "I'm sure I want to shoot," she said. "I'm not sure I want to become a product." Michael made a sound somewhere between a grunt and a laugh. "Good," he said simply. "Stay that way." Another pause. Then he added, "Your father would be proud. Not because you hit targets, because you stayed yourself." Lee closed her eyes briefly, felt the truth settle deep in her bones. "Thanks, Michael." "No thanks needed, kid," he said. "Just keep pulling that trigger straight." The call ended. The city hummed on. And Lee sat there quietly, knowing exactly what she had to do. 2 days later, Lee returned every offer, respectfully, gratefully, but firmly. No sponsorships, no TV deals, no public relations managers crafting her story. She would compete on her own terms. She would shoot, not to sell shoes or scopes or social media dreams, but because she loved it, because she had promised, not to the crowd, not to the cameras, but to a man who once taught a little girl to trust her breath, her focus, and her silence. And some promises are too sacred to sell. The Pine Valley Elite Board met in closed session that week. They wanted to offer Lee honorary membership, free range access, invitations to exhibitions, official club ambassador status. Mr. Delaney, the manager, argued passionately for it. "She's the best we've ever seen," he said. "And more importantly, she's the best kind of shooter, quiet, honorable, true." The board voted unanimously. When Delaney approached Lee with the offer, she listened politely, smiled, and declined, not out of pride, not out of rebellion, but because the range had never belonged to any one name. It belonged to the shot, to the breath, to the silence that follows a bullet striking home, and Leah Hunter intended to keep it that way. Weeks later, as the club hosted another open day, Lee sat quietly on a bench near the practice lanes. A young girl, no more than 10, awkwardly clutching a tiny competition rifle, stood nervously at the start of the firing line. The other kids laughed behind their hands. Someone whispered, "She's too small. She won't hit anything." The girl blinked rapidly, fighting tears. Lee rose, walked over, kneeled down beside her. "You ready?" Lee asked gently. The girl nodded hesitantly. Lee adjusted her stance, guided her hands. "Focus on the breath," she said. "Forget the noise." The girl wiped her face, squared her shoulders, took aim, fired. The shot rang out crisp and clean. The target 50 yards away shuddered as the round struck near center. A gasp rose from the onlookers. Lee smiled. "Good," she said simply. The girl beamed, not because she had impressed anyone, but because for the first time she believed in her own aim. And that was the true silence Leah Hunter had always been fighting for, not the silence of the beaten, not the silence of the forgotten, but the silence of belief, steady, strong, unstoppable. Legends aren't born in stadiums. They're not written by headlines or gilded trophies. Real legends are quieter. They are stitched into the world through simple moments, through steady hands, unshaken breath, and promises kept when no one is watching. Leah Hunter never set out to become a legend. She only set out to stay true. And that, more than anything else, is why her name was never forgotten. Spring melted into summer. The pine trees around Pine Valley grew lush again, bending under the warm breeze. New shooters came to the range, their faces bright with hope and nerves. The old guard changed too. Some legends faded away, stepping back quietly, sensing their time had passed. Others adapted, respecting the new current Lee had stirred into the air, and Lee she stayed, not as a celebrity, not as a brand, but as a reminder of what excellence actually looked like when it wore no crown. The club quietly created a new award that year, the Hunter Cup. Named not for the legends who had filled their trophy cases for decades, but for the woman who had redefined what it meant to be a shooter: focus, integrity, mastery, silence. The first Hunter Cup was awarded to a teenage girl who, like Lee, came from nowhere special, no coach, no pedigree. Just breathe, courage, and discipline. When they asked Lee to present the award, she almost declined. She wasn't comfortable with spotlights, but then she thought of her father, of Michael Reeves, of the long line of quiet warriors who had taught her by example, so she accepted. She stood on the podium in simple jeans and a dark gray jacket, no logos, no glamour. She shook the girl's trembling hand, and she said the only words that mattered: stay true. Offers never stopped coming. Brands still called. Networks still offered television deals. Shooting schools begged her to endorse them, but Lee chose a different path. Instead of signing contracts, she built a small, private training program at the far end of the range. No glitz, no cameras, just a battered sign nailed to the fence that read, "Hunter's Line." Anyone could come. First-timers, veterans, kids with duct-taped rifles and dreams bigger than their means. Lee taught them all the same way, quietly, carefully, with absolute respect for the craft. She didn't teach them to win. She taught them to stand steady, to breathe when the world screamed at them, to panic, to fire when it mattered, and to know that real worth was never written in gold lettering. It was carved in the space between breath and bullet. Sometimes, late at night, Lee would sit alone on Lane 17, the place where it all began. The stars stretched overhead like silent witnesses, the targets barely visible in the dim moonlight. She would load a few rounds into her old Remington, not to prove anything, not to practice, just to remember. Crack one shot, perfect. Crack another, steady as heartbeat. Each shot a whispered conversation with the past. Each impact a reaffirmation of the road she had chosen, and the price she was proud to pay. Hunter Kane visited once. Years later, his hair was grayer, his gait a little slower. But when he saw Lee coaching a small group of kids on the range, he smiled quietly to himself. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. Some stories, once finished, don't need editing, only appreciation. He left without speaking to her, but he left lighter than he arrived. Because he knew now what he hadn't known before. True greatness doesn't fade others. It lights the way for them. One evening, as Lee packed up after a long day of coaching, Michael Reeves appeared at the gate. He was older now, walking with a slight limp from a surgery he'd put off too long. But his eyes were the same, sharp, proud, quietly amused. "You built something, kid," he said, nodding toward the small group of young shooters laughing at the far end of the lot. Lee wiped her hands on her jeans. "Wasn't the plan," she said, smiling. "Storms don't make plans," Michael said. "They just change the weather." He handed her an old, worn envelope. Inside was a faded photograph, her father standing at a long-forgotten range. Behind him, a wooden board nailed to a post. Hand-painted words: "Stay true, breathe deep, fire honest." Lee traced the edges of the photo with her thumb. "I think he'd be proud," she said softly. Michael nodded. "He'd be more than proud. He'd be standing right here, telling you it's not about what you hit." Lee looked up. "It's about what you stand for," she finished. Michael smiled. "Exactly." As the seasons turned, the world beyond Pine Valley spun faster. New champions rose, records shattered, technology improved, rifles got smarter, scopes got sharper. But no matter how much changed, one thing remained: the story of a simple woman with no sponsors, no golden name, only her breath, her patience, and her focus, who walked onto a range full of legends, and silenced them with nothing but truth. And somewhere, down a gravel path lined with pine trees, past a battered sign that reads Hunter's Line, you might still find her kneeling behind an old Remington rifle, guiding a nervous kid's hands, reminding them how to find stillness in the noise. No fanfare, no flash, just breathe, focus, release, and the kind of silence that even legends must respect, because Leah Hunter didn't just silence the legends. She became something legends could never touch: timeless.